Jai Hind everyone. We are fortunate today to have amongst us Dr. Harsh Pant from ORF, and any one of you who has been in the academic world or have been having some kind of connect with anything that directly or indirectly will certainly know him. Uh, though I just mentioned before we formally started that he's synonym of ORF, the level at which ORF is today is, to my mind, the best think tank, in India. The kind of work they do, the kind of interfaces they create, and the kind of dialogues, including Lycina dialogue, which they nurture for the country's good, and the kind of presence they have in India, USA, and I've been told that they are also going to Dubai shortly. So actually, it is taking India to a different level altogether, and I shall fail in my duty if I do not mention that the bulk of that work has been done by the person whom you are meeting today. As far as the subject is concerned, today he shall touch upon the certain salient aspects of Indo-Pacific. So the subject may appear, something which you would have heard often, but he will, cover more in the terms of defense domain, as relevant to the Indo-Pacific. And this will be very, very good insight, and it will be a kind of continuous what we heard on 13th June on the Indo-Pacific. Indo-Pacific, as you are well aware, that is a very, very wide area. Uh, it has implications for most countries in the world. Besides, being a repository of wealth as well as conflicts, and in that more focus on South China Sea. So without much ado to the subject, I shall now request Professor Haspan to take the stage and share his knowledge with us, those who are present here, and also the audience who have joined us.
Thank you, sir, and thank you for having me here. It's always good to be able to talk to a diverse set of audience. I've never been to CENJOWS before, so thank you for this opportunity. As you mentioned, perhaps Indo-Pacific was discussed earlier in such a common area, which is generally touched upon. Any conversation on any aspect of international relations today, you tend to end up talking about the Indo-Pacific. Sometimes the meanings might be different interpretations in different parts of the world. But largely, I think people understand when you say Indo-Pacific, they understand the geography and largely what the context in which it is about. So what I thought I would briefly do is to touch the wide range of the geography itself, its evolution, and how it has impacted individuals, some of the key nations in that geography, because in terms of their defense policies, because one of the ways in which you can ascertain how the regional order or global order is evolving is by looking at the defense policies as they have moved into and what they have moved into in recent past. So that is broadly the thrust of what I want to talk about. If we can move forward. This, I think, in some ways goes without saying, as the Director General mentioned, you may have had a lot of discussions around Indo-Pacific and what it means for global politics. But I think, in a sense, what we are talking about is this emergence of a new new strategic geography, which in some ways forces us or forces the nations in the region to rethink what their periphery looks like and what kind of challenges one has to map out. Now, if you're looking at the linkage that is being drawn between Indian Ocean and Pacific Ocean and how that has changed the way we approach those strategic geographies, it is germane to not only India, which of course we talk about often, that look, India's geographical contours have suddenly become different. We are looking at regions through a different lens. If you talk of Indo-Pacific, there is a certain connotation in saying that India is an Indian Ocean country and India is an Indo-Pacific country. And the nomenclature itself uh, defines the parameters through which you will look at the challenges, you will look at the threats, and you will also look at the opportunities. And in this particular case, the strategic location of India and the strategic location and the centrality of the Indo-Pacific perhaps in more ways than one contributes to the way we are looking at the shifting global balance of power, the shifting center of gravity of global economics. And again, as if you are part of, if you have countries like China, India, Japan, Korea, ASEAN, you know, in the region, you can see, you can assess the dynamism, economic dynamism in the region, and you can understand the implications. Similarly, in terms of resources, in terms of so whichever way you are looking at this, the Indo-Pacific, there is a certain resonance in terms of the in terms of what it brings to the table in our conversation of international relations. And this, if you're just looking at the choke points, if you're looking at trade routes, trade volume, almost all of these issues are intricately linked with this idea of why this geography is so important, and why some of the trend lines that we are drawing now onwards, whether it is related to trade, whether it is related to energy, whether it is related to strategic dynamic. All of these questions are linked in more ways than one with this question of how do you define the contours of the Indo-Pacific. Next. Now, if one thinks about the evolution of the security challenges, in some ways, this is a very traditional sort of diversification, traditional versus non-traditional. But if you're thinking of how these security challenges in the region have emerged and how we have started thinking about it, till the time Indo-Pacific was being talked about as the primary prism through which you understand the region and then the changing geopolitics. A lot of these questions, whether it is South China Sea, East China Sea, and what is happening, for example, now of course Taiwan Strait has become such an important issue. Suddenly, it has become an important issue, and it is not a coincidence that you have the rising tension in the Taiwan Strait at the same time when the Indo-Pacific logic has become strong, because this is linked in some ways how China views the changing geopolitical contours and how others view what is happening in the region. So you can see how a lot of the questions that we are asking today about the disputes in the region, traditional disputes in the region, the military presence of major countries in the region, how China has been a key instigator in some ways of defining the parameters of the Indo-Pacific through Belt and Road, and how the response to it by other actors is also a reflection of how they are reacting to what is changing in the region. And that is, in some ways, again, a response to broadly the logic of the Indo-Pacific, and similarly the non-traditional security issues, from marine ecosystem all the way to piracy. They are all related to this idea that you have a number of actors in the region for whom many of these challenges at times were disparate to begin with, but have coalesced around this idea that now, if you are looking at the world through this prism of Indo-Pacific, it makes a lot of sense to think about either common threats or common opportunities. And I think that is in some ways the defining thread of our times, that we are looking at new coalitions being built. We are looking at new consolidation of new relationships. When, at a time when you have a range of disputes, a range of challenges, and a redefinition of what perhaps Indo-Pacific means for a range of countries in the region. So if you think if you think about the whole logic of what is happening in the region, the structural change is very fundamental. And the structural change comes from this idea that you have a larger balance of power shift happening, uh, not only in the Indo-Pacific, but at the global level. And in some ways, what is happening in the Indo-Pacific becomes the frame through which you are trying to understand what is happening at the global level. Now, the structural change is reflective in the balance of power shift, in the shift that you have today, a diverse set of political systems, and particularly, I think, two authoritarian versus the democratic ones, which are trying to redefine their contours of the relationship. And I think sometimes we, uh, particularly in India, we don't take this idea of democracy versus the rest as a very important fault line. But we can see how that fault line is emerging. We may not like it, but I think our not liking it does not change the fact on the ground. Putin's visit to North Korea is a reflection of that trend, that we are seeing a consolidation around the political systems as well. And I think that geopolitical fragmentation, that divide that we are witnessing around the world is being reflected not simply in diverse national interest, but also in diverse set of political systems and how they are being looked at through a larger fragmented lens. And I think that is something that we should be talking more about, because I think it complicates for a country like India that has so far maintained diverse set of relationships with diverse set of actors. It does add a complexity to an already very complex matrix of challenges. The other issue, structural issues, of course, Indo-Pacific itself does not have any institutional mechanism. We don't have a pan-Indo-Pacific institutional framework. So because Indo-Pacific itself is a new geography, because Indo-Pacific itself is still trying to, nations in the Indo-Pacific are still trying to grapple with what it exactly means. The lack of an institutional framework enhances the structural challenge. So because you have a structural challenge and you don't have an institutional framework to manage it, you are also, when you say flux, it amplifies that flux. So you have two distinct set of structural challenges which are related, which we study, for example, in IR 101, that you have a structural change and that structural change is not reflected in the institutional systems that you have in place. And again, those institutional weaknesses are now being reflected across the board. For example, ASEAN, which at one point was seen as very, very effective organization, today looks completely incapable of managing even some of the basic challenges that it faces. So I think, again, that the problems that ASEAN is facing is primarily reflecting the geopolitical flux in the system. So I think, again, how do we think of the institutional challenge and how do we think of the institutional issues become important? And again, what we are witnessing now is because of those institutional weaknesses, we are moving towards this age of minilaterals and plurilaterals and whatnot. You have a range of trilaterals, Quad, of course, is there, AUKUS, and others, which are trying to fill that vacuum because you don't have a formal multilateral framework. You have a range of minilateral frameworks that are trying to fill that space. Again, underscoring the institutional weaknesses in the region and underscoring the defense and conflict resolution challenges in the region. And of course, the structural challenge of the disputes, of the territorial disputes that exist, whether it is the maritime ones or the India-China border ones. I think they reflect once again the structural shift that is happening in the Indo-Pacific, that it is not simply a dynamic between India and the US, China and the US, which is the broader set of, broader frame. But you also have a number of other structural issues, and India is also rising at a time when China is rising. So you have that competition and you have that contestation between them. So again, if you look at the structural challenges and how they impact, in some ways, what is happening, at a more situational level, where you have military escalation, economic shocks, political instability, socio-political instability. All of these factors, if you combine them, they, at one point they reflect the realities of the structural change, and at the other they amplify that structural change, because if you have issues like the arms race or supply chain disruptions, they inevitably enhance the questions of how do you then start framing the structural response to it. For example, post-COVID, the supply chain issue became so very important. But it was merely in some ways conceptually, if you think about it, it is a reflection of where the structural relationship between US and China was going. If COVID would not have happened, the same supply chain issue would have been part of the discussion, but it would have come much later. COVID just allowed us to frame that response at a time of particular vulnerability, to expose that vulnerability at a particular point. But if we did not have COVID, for example, the same issues, given the trajectory of US-China relationship, would have come, say, 5, 10 years down the line. But it had to come given the structural change that was happening within the system. But what you're looking at now, whether it is military escalation or economic challenge, or even this idea of how countries are using disinformation, misinformation to create political and social instability across the board. I think all those questions, if you compress them together, you see a range of challenges in the Indo-Pacific that are now framing the defense policies, the national security policies of the countries. Next slide, please. So just I added a bit here on how do you theoretically understand from a conceptual point of view. Are there ways in which we can understand conceptually some of these changes? Of course, you have the power transition idea that we are in a phase of power transition happening. Something is happening. We may not exactly have a handle on what is happening, but we know that something is happening. That the unipolar moment of 1990s is gone. That whether it is multipolarity of some kind or a bipolar world order, we are not there yet, but we know that the transition has begun to happen. We also know that the hegemon that used to create some kind of stability is no longer that hegemon, and therefore the consequences of that lack of hegemony are also being felt. That when you look at the consequences in Europe, for example, post-Ukraine war, you look at the Middle East crisis, a lot of them are reflective of this idea that look, the hegemon is no longer providing that stability that the global order rested on for a while. Then, of course, you have the security dilemma argument that look, you have not only the US-China security dilemma, but you have China and others, which are also trying to, including India. And then, of course, you have this idea of what kind of security partnerships are needed to bring a certain kind of a balance in the system. And then again, a very interesting argument of the kind that we have not seen before. Again, this is new. The whole logic of multilateral institutions and how we should whether multilateral institutions of the traditional kind, of the formal kind that we've seen in the past, will continue to be with us in the future. None of these, what are listed here, Quad, Octus, IPEF, none of these are very formal institutional frameworks. They're all largely informal ad hoc coalitions of like-minded countries. And now whether this is going to be the defining feature of our times to give some balance to the system, we don't know. But that's where we seem to be moving in the context of how we conceptually understand some of these issues. So by and large, if one thinks of the great power dynamic, you are looking at the US-China contestation. US-China contestation, which, as I was mentioning earlier, is largely reflective of the wider challenge that one was sort of part of during the Cold War, for example. The difference being that this now today you have a context in which US and China, despite their structural change and challenge, they remain economically intertwined. So when we are talking of a post 1990s global economic order framework, but what kind of a framework that is going to be, that remains very, very unclear. We are talking of decoupling and de-risking in certain sectors. Decoupling, Americans are no longer talking about it. Europeans have also moved to de-risking. But those questions are fundamentally embedded in how do we de-risk our critical technologies, and how do we sort of restructure the supply chains. Because without that, the whole notion of having two distinct set of global economic frameworks remains very, very difficult to envision. And so when you are thinking of how our national security policies and economic policies today have become intertwined with have become intertwined with each other, that is, I think, a fundamental shift in the way we even conceptually thought about or used to think about some of these issues. In the past, for example, one of the basic tenets of our engagement on economic issues used to be, and this is even today taught in the classrooms, right? That economic interdependence is good. Now, economic interdependence in theory is good, but economic interdependence of a kind in which national security implications are becoming the most important driver. There, the kind of questions you are asking is then, who do we trade with? Do we, the argument that, if you trade with countries and it's much economic interdependence or greater trade allows you greater political stability or political trust. But now you are saying we only trade with countries where we have political trust. We are only going to share technologies with countries where there is political trust. So political trust is becoming the driver of economic engagement rather than the other way around. And this, in some ways, is a fundamental restructuring of the way we used to think about post-1990s global economic order, when the whole logic of China's entry into the global economic order was premised on this argument that, look, the more China is integrated into the global economic order, the better it is going to be for the global political order. Now that is, of course, has been turned upside down. Now everything is about isolating China and countries that are friends with China, or countries that think like China. So in that sense, how do we think about between the US and between US and China and their relationship, the kind of threat perceptions, the kind of security priorities that we are seeing emerge is actually quite antagonistic. That despite the fact, and we are seeing now a lot of the questions that are being asked in both capitals, and I think particularly the Washington, if you see step by step, every single issue that American political establishment at one point thought was dead or has been resolved to an extent, is now being rigged up, right? We have had a US delegation now visiting the Dalai Lama. Now the message is very clear that, look, the US House of Congress, there is a bipartisan support for now reinvigorating the Tibet question. And similarly, the Taiwan question has been taken up a few years back. So in a sense, the body politic in the US is now looking at some of these questions of the stability of the US-China relationship is no longer taken as a given. That you have now a range of issues on which questions are being asked and questions are being framed that for a lot of the analysts and for a lot of the observers, some of these questions, I mean, no one a decade back thought that a number of these questions would be raised. No one thought that the questions of the fundamental of where China fits in the American technology architecture would be raised, because it was taken as a given that now they are intertwined and nothing is going to change that reality, and therefore the relationship would continue. Similarly, on the questions of Tibet and Taiwan, I think there is a lot of flux in the system. Though American official policy has not changed, but you can see the tensions within. So, and similarly, on the Chinese side, if you look at their relationship with Russia today, their engagement with a number of other actors that is now becoming more prevalent, they are also re-looking at some of the fundamental questions, because for them also the relationship that they shared, the assumptions about that relationship have to undergo a change. So I think if you're looking at the great power dynamic and how that great power dynamic engages the question of Indo-Pacific, that is, I think, in some ways fundamental to the way others in the region also are going to see this very interesting evolution of a very interesting relationship. Next, please. So, if one looks at US and China and their some of the basic tenets of their defense policy, we are looking at the US not only moving from to a more forward-leaning approach on the question of defense posture, not only relying much more on partners, on sharing, burden sharing, on asking its partners to do more, but also this idea of an integrated deterrence where this is this becomes an across the board endeavor, that this is not simply about defense, not being simply about defense, but also involving the technology and the economic dimensions to this question. That how are we changing our defense posture is now part of the larger framework of integrated deterrence, where the partnerships that we are cultivating, the alliances that we traditionally have, will also have to reorient to this question of on economy and technology. So this is, I think, a fundamental shift in the way the earlier approach used to look at the question, and now as they are looking at this question. And similarly, when you look at China, this idea that, of course, there is military modernization happening. Of course, there is still reliance on A2AD. But by and large, the idea is that, look, this is going to be a much more complex endeavor, and therefore this reliance on gray zone warfare or economic tactics is going to also be a very, very important part of this dynamic, because this gives China a lever that perhaps even America does not have in the region. And therefore using that again and again, and you see that very, very interestingly that they have used. For example, if you go to a country like Australia, now Australians have had a very interesting relationship with the US, with China in recent past. Australia used to be a very, very close economic partner of China, and then came a period where the relationship actually nosedived. And now you see China reviving that, at least making an effort in revising its approach to Australia. There have been Australian Prime Minister is in China, and Chinese President was there in Australia, trying to get back to the basics. After making it very clear to the Chinese, to the Australians, that economic levers that China commands can be used against it, and Australia's pushback, and now China coming back and saying that we want to stabilize this relationship. Now there are multiple, arguments that one can make about why that is happening. It can also be a sign that Australia being seen as one of the weakest links in Quad, perhaps because of the economic dynamic. Perhaps it's also an attempt to weaken the larger Quad framework in the Indo-Pacific. Also, Australia being part of AUKUS, there are elements there which perhaps might work for China. But essentially, the approach that China seems to be using, and is larger part of its posturing in the region, is how do you assess your strategic competition with the US beyond just using military modernization. And then you also see bit by bit, you can call it regional salami slicing of taking on countries individually. So at the moment you have, of course, India is there, but you also have very, very aggressive tactics against Philippines. We have seen, for example, how Japan had already been told that, look, there are limits to what you can do, and we will continue to press this case. And then, of course, you have the Taiwan Strait where a lot is happening. So you do see that salami slicing of America's regional partners, and their approach. So in that sense, the Chinese defense posture continues to evolve depending on the kind of Indo-Pacific realities that are evolving. Now, if you look at three of these actors in the region. Now, India, I don't want to talk about much, because India and Indian defense policy, generally, there's a lot of discussion. But if one thinks about India's own role and India's own engagement in the Indo-Pacific, it has been fairly interesting that you have had a case where India, from a very focused approach or inward-oriented approach, would argue, towards South Asia and Indian Ocean, has now given space to a larger, sort of a more broad-based approach to the Indo-Pacific. So this idea that India will say something on South China Sea, India will push on what is happening in the Philippines, India will make a case on India in the South Pacific Islands case. I think that the broader the scope of the Indo-Pacific engagement and the broader Indian approach has been. Now, whether it is in sync with India's means, that is a broader issue that I don't want to touch. But I think in some ways the question that India is also being forced to ask is also related to this question of supply chains, is also related to this question of economic interdependence, and what kind of a relationship we want to have with a range of other actors in the region. So India's, in that sense, despite being, having this challenge at the border, India's maritime security architecture has evolved in the last decade. And as the Indo-Pacific argument has evolved, I think there has also been a pressure that, look, if India wants to be a partner in the Quad, if India wants to have a say in what is happening in the wider Indo-Pacific, then I think certain things that India needs to exemplify and articulate. So that is very, in a nutshell, in a very broad brush way, India question. But if you think of Japan and for example, ASEAN, and I'll touch three countries in ASEAN in particular, you do see a certain, and in fact, a significant shift in the way defense policies are being articulated and defense policies are being operationalized. So now, if you just think of Japan, I think this has been one of the most significant stories of the last decade, of how from Shinzo Abe onwards, we have had a significant shift in the Japanese approach to defense. Of course, this is linked to China's assertion. This is linked to the Chinese question, but this is also linked to the wider Indo-Pacific dynamic. And one can go back to the first speech that Shinzo Abe gave to the Indian Parliament in 2007, where he was articulating this idea of the conference of the two seas. There he also said that, look, even, of course, India will have to do much more, as he was arguing, but he also said Japan will have to do much more. And I think towards that, he gradually shifted the goalpost, and his successors have continued to move in that direction. And despite the fact that in Japan itself, there is a strong debate as to how far Japan can and cannot go. But I think the important part here is not whether Japan will completely change its constitution or not, or will be able to do that or not. But I think the fact that within those constraints, Japan has been gradually moving forward in a direction that few envisioned, say, before 2007. That is, I think, a big story in terms of how far Japan has come in reconfiguring its defense posture. So, despite the debate within Japan, and I think this is an important point, that in Japan there is no consensus on this question, and it's possible that tomorrow the LDP, which is the ruling party, might get defeated in the next elections, and that might change the context in which Japan is operating. But even within those constraints, what Japan has been able to do is quite fundamental, and it's not simply with its like-minded partners and in the Indo-Pacific, but if you also see Japan signing a security agreement with Ukraine. Now, a part of this is that it did not have to do it, but it did it because it enhanced its credibility vis-a-vis the US in the Indo-Pacific. So I think what Japan has been able to do in the Indo-Pacific has been quite interesting, and perhaps one of the more understudied aspects of how Japan is one of the critical players in the Indo-Pacific has been able to shift its own posture, and by shifting its own posture has been able to do two things. One, it has been able to convince the Americans to stay, that look, I'm doing this because Americans are now saying that our regional partners should be doing more. So by reconfiguring its own defense policy, Japan has been able to reassure Americans, and Japan has been able to push the Americans to continue to engage in the region. And B, it has been able to give a balance to countries to other like-minded countries in the region, that they are India or Australia, or even some of the ASEAN member states that want to see greater involvement by Japan. And this, I think, brings us to this question of ASEAN, which has often been seen, and we often talk of ASEAN as central to the Indo-Pacific narrative. And ASEAN centrality, if you read any major powers Indo-Pacific outlook or policy, they will have ASEAN centrality as a key element of that. And there is a logical reason to do that. ASEAN is not only physically central, in some ways geographically central, but also because you have these smaller Southeast Asian countries playing a very important role, in deciding which way the balance of power will tilt. So I think keeping them in good humor is an important part of all actors. And what has happened over the last few years is that ASEAN, which used to rely on this balance between US and China, that US will guarantee their security and China will guarantee their economy, that balance has come unstuck because the relationship between US and China has come unstuck. And that means that ASEAN itself has to now relook at its own, at the fundamentals. And in that sense, as we were discussing, it has not been able to do that. It has not been able to come out with anything specific on either the code of conduct or just how do you manage this transition in the region. And so the divisions within ASEAN are now quite stark. And while we continue and other countries, nations, continue to talk about ASEAN centrality, how far that ASEAN centrality is going to be an operational construct going forward, that is a big question as of now. So if you look at these three countries, if you look at these three actors, I think in some ways they are the ones who are defining ASEAN's defense policy, because the others are largely irrelevant. Either they do not have the capacity or they are too closely tied in with the Chinese. But these three actors have, Indonesia has the ability, given its geography, and Philippines and Vietnam, given their relationship with China, and given how they are standing up to China, offer an insight into how ASEAN as a group may also splinter and decide to go in two different ways, particularly when it comes to defense policies, and how those changes are going to be very, very key in deciding how the balance of power in that part, in the critical central part of Indo-Pacific evolves. So if you think of the of Indonesia, Indonesia has been hedging for a while. Now Indonesia's role of geographical centrality is critical. Indonesia and Australia's relationship is very critical for Indonesia to manage a large swathe of Southern Pacific. But what Indonesia gradually has been trying to do is also in some ways to diversify and build its capacity. For example, very close India-Indonesia negotiations are also underway for a range of defense equipment. For example, India held one of its biggest defense enclaves recently in Indonesia. So the idea being that because the US-China balance is not there for Indonesia, Indonesia is looking at other actors to help Indonesia move forward. And the defense posture in particular is going to be very, very critical in that regard. The maritime fulcrum argument that Widodo has made and his successor is likely to continue with that idea, and is likely to, because Widodo did not really invest in that idea. He gave that idea, he articulated it, but he did not do much with it. And there are signs that his successor is now going to move forward and then going to operationalize that idea. Given what is happening and given how ASEAN itself is not being able to move forward. Then you have Philippines and Vietnam. Of course, both of these they are different. Philippines is a US treaty ally, whereas Vietnam has a policy of no alliances. But if you look at the Vietnamese, the arc of Vietnam-US relationship, that's quite significant. I mean, the way Vietnam and US have undergone, have changed their relationship, perhaps also tells us how nations evolve and how they look at the reality on the ground and adjust. So in some ways, without being an ally of the US, Vietnam is also signaling and messaging to a range of actors in the region, not only the US, but not only to China, but others as well, that it has the ability to still attract countries like the US. It has the ability to still manage this very fine balance between US and China. And it continues to be very, very assertive on South China Sea, in the South China Sea dispute. So in a sense, Vietnam is one bookend and Philippines is the other, which is now almost on a fighting mode with the Chinese. Every day there are reports of how the relationship is evolving. So you have a very distinct set of two actors. Vietnam has so far avoided directly confronting the Chinese, but indirectly signaling to China that, look, we have other options. we have partners, and we are open to this, to the idea of America being a close partner. But Philippines and the way China has targeted Philippines in recent months has gone completely all out and made it very clear that America is going to be the primary defense provider, and we are going to, of course, move ahead with other kinds of partnerships in the region and beyond. So if you're looking at ASEAN today, ASEAN centrality is more of a, it has become more of a rhetoric than anything substantive to divide your foreign defense policy and to frame your defense policy. Whereas if you have to look at the individual defense policies of ASEAN member states to figure out how these relationships are going to evolve and what kind of defense policies individual countries are actually undertaking and building. So just very briefly, if you look at specifically to what individual ASEAN member states stand in terms of their military expenditure, in terms of their both as a percentage of GDP and as general government expenditure, you're seeing a diversity there, and you're seeing how different countries are approaching the logic differently. You can see certain countries, the strategic postures being very, very different. You can see the prioritization of what countries as a unit, as a whole. ASEAN continues to talk about its centrality. The ASEAN countries as a unit become very, very sensitive whenever they are not part of the picture. But as you can see, they are also doing their own thing. They are also now divided much more than they've ever been. And this will have implications for the Indo-Pacific balance of power. Now, when you have this kind of diversification in the region, when you have this kind of a vacuum, institutional vacuum in the region, you inevitably see some innovation happening. And I think the innovation in the Indo-Pacific has happened in the case of how alliances and cooperation is being redefined. As I mentioned previously, we are looking at ad hoc coalitions emerging, we are looking at most functional coalitions emerging, and we are looking at like-minded countries trying to grapple with functional issues together. And this is what largely Quad and AUKUS have become, that you have a group of countries that are now trying to work together on specific issue areas rather than coming together in formal alliances. And I think this is likely to be the mode that will continue. On the other hand, you have the Chinese. You see, this is largely the US and the like-minded countries in the region and their approach. The Chinese approach still is very highly reliant still on the economic angle, which still might be and very difficult for the US and for the West to take on, because the economic heft that China commands in the region is still very, very significant. Next, please. So a few things, to conclude. In a sense, much before we started, the others started thinking of the Indo-Pacific as a cohesive unit. Of course, Shinzo Abe talked of it in 2007. But I think the operationalization of his idea actually owes to China, because the way China brought the region together under one economic, as part of its own economic relationships, and of course the way it defined Belt and Road Initiative globally, much before others could think of the operational realities of the Conference of the Two Seas, China had made that operationally possible. And with that, a lot of the levers that China today commands, economic influence, you have territorial assertion and military modernization, were impacted by that time. The US came to the Indo-Pacific late. The US came to it again as a response to what China was doing. But also, sometimes we forget that when George W. Bush came to power, and when Condoleezza Rice, she wrote this piece in Foreign Affairs when George W. Bush was contesting elections, and she was she was the primary advisor to him. It was
she who articulated this idea, not in the language of the Indo-Pacific, but her articulation was very simple, that you cannot look at South Asia and the rest of Asia as two distinct units. You have to bring India into the Asian balance of power matrix. She was writing from an American perspective, but basically arguing that you have to start looking at Indian Ocean and Pacific Oceans as one contiguous zone, which basically later on Shinzo Abe evolved into the Conference of the Two Seas. But Americans were trying to do that, um, started doing that in 2000s when George W. Bush came to power. However, they got distracted by the war on terror and other things, and China got that space to maneuver, and therefore that whole decade where when Americans were fighting these wars in Afghanistan and then in Iraq, China was building itself in what we today call Indo-Pacific, and therefore America's approach to regional alliances and partnerships has also been lagging behind. Although again, the whole logic of the nuclear deal was to build India as a partner, but it took a while before that partnership could evolve into this partnership of how you looked at this entire matrix through one lens. And now, of course, you have the range of other actors that are contributing. So you have India, ASEAN, Australia, Japan, all contributing in how this is going to be determined and how the frame of reference is going to be determined. It is, in a sense, Indo-Pacific, as we were discussing, looks very multipolar. You have multiple poles, you have multiple actors that have an ability to shape the balance of power in the region. And therefore, what the Japanese are doing, what the Indians are doing, what the ASEAN, individual countries of ASEAN, they are able to do, and how Australia is able to bring to bear its weight. All of that will have implications on how the security landscape of the looks like. So I think I would briefly end by saying that in some ways it has become fashionable to say that everything is in flux. But in the Indo-Pacific, what we are looking at, I think a lot of the trend lines are very clear. The trend lines that you will have China making its presence felt, that has been very clear for a long time. But you also now have American pushback in the region that is quite clear, that Americans are pushing back and they will create new frameworks and new alliances. Of course, Trump remains an uncertainty and how he will play that, although in his first term, he was very conventional when it came to the Indo-Pacific. But I think the third element here is perhaps more important, that how the smaller countries in the region will play their role and how their policies are going to be defined will perhaps have a greater bearing, because for America, Americans always can withdraw. And there is, if you look at the domestic political debate in the US, it is very inward looking at the moment. The domestic politics in the US does not look very comfortable with power projection. So there is an elite discussion and there is a broader political discussion which is quite distinct. But if that happens, then I think it's very unlikely. But the Americans are going to rely more and more on what the regional actors are going to, how they are. Therefore, policies, whether it's just foreign policy or defense policy or national security policy, many of these actors that I think are very important in determining how the security landscape in the Indo-Pacific is. Thank you.